the last month of the year, which was the month Adar, the Jewish calendar, on the 13th day of that month, that all Jews, men and women, boys and girls, all in that kingdom would be destroyed. He had promised the king that also if I can do this, put out this decree, I'll bring lots of money into the treasury. He was going to bring lots of money in the treasury because he was going to take the money from those Jewish people that they had earned, and that would be the money. But the king says, no, I don't need your money. I don't need, you do what you want to do. And so Haman sent out that decree. It was sent by post, the Bible says. Like we get letters from the post office or the postman. And so the post went throughout the kingdom, and they delivered these letters, and they posted them up everywhere where they could be read. And it brought a great heartache among the land of Persia. The Jewish people were very upset, and they were mourning, and they were very upset. Mordecai, in chapter number 4, Mordecai, when he heard this, when he saw in Shushan the palace, it was posted there as well, that all the Jews of the kingdom were going to be killed, he began to mourn, and he began to fast, and he was not knowing what to do. And so all the Jews, everywhere you would go in the kingdom, the Jewish people were crying and weeping and hugging each other and saying, what can we do? I mean, this was the law of the Medes and the Persians. It could not be altered. It was going to take place. And so Mordecai realized that someone had to get to the king and try to talk to the king and see if he could do something. Not anyone could go in to see the king. Matter of fact, the kings of Persia allowed no one to come into their presence with a bad report. He didn't want to hear any bad news. You could only come before the king with good news, and you could only come to the king when you were bidden. The king had to ask for you. It really seems in the scriptures that you really could not request to visit him, but you had to wait for him to request you to visit him. The kings were really secluded because they had this fear that their life would be taken. Most kings and monarchs of those days got assassinated finally. One day Mordecai, when he was, it had happened that when Mordecai was at the king's gate, he heard a couple of the men that worked for the king talking, and they were secretly talking, but he overheard them. And they said they wanted to kill the king. They plotted to kill the king. So Mordecai said, wow, this is not good. So he went to Esther, his daughter, and he said, you need to get to the king and let him know that 2 men are planning to kill him. And so she did, and the king investigated that, found out it was true, and had those 2 men put to death. And it was written in his chronicles. So this night, Mordecai was very upset, and so he sent to Esther and said, Esther, you have to go see the king. And she said, I can't. I mean, I don't know if he might even be mad at me. There's been 30 days. I haven't been to see him in 30 days. He hadn't called for me in 30 days, so I just can't walk in there. If you walk into the presence of the king without being invited, it could be sudden death. The only exception, if he holds out his scepter, his golden scepter, then you can come in his presence. But if you come in unannounced and he doesn't hold out his golden scepter, you die. And he said, look at it here, and look in chapter, I think in chapter number 4, in verse, the last part of verse 14, chapter 4 and verse 14, Mordecai is talking to Esther, and he said, who knowest whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? He's saying, Esther, who knows, the reason you are queen, the reason you have been elevated to be queen could be for this particular purpose. Because after all, Esther, the decree is out for all Jews to be killed. And remember, you are a Jew. I mean, it's your life at stake as well as the life of all other Jews at stake. Who knows that you've been raised up to come into the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther sent back an answer to Mordecai. It's recorded in chapter 16 there, verse 15 of chapter number 4. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. She said, "Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. And I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go into the king, which is not according to the law." According to the law, I cannot go to the king. I've not been invited to the king. And she says, "And if I perish, I perish." It reminds me of Romans chapter number 12. And Paul said, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice." Paul said, what are you willing to do to serve the Lord? Are you willing to take a risk for the things of the Lord? And she said, "If I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had bidden him. And so there was a 3-day fast. Mordecai was fasting outside of the palace, and Esther and her maidens were fasting inside the palace. So now we come to chapter 5, and this is our message for tonight. Now it came to pass, verse 1 says, and it always comes to pass, on the 3rd day, that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne. That's an interesting thought. The king sat upon his royal throne. When the king spoke from his throne, when he made decrees from his throne, they were unchangeable decrees. Reminder of the Pope, when he sits on his throne, it said that he is infallible when he speaks from the throne. Wow, such foolishness. But he sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And so here we have it. And so it was, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. Wow. She obtained favor in his sight. Well, I believe that favor was favor that God allowed her to have in the sight of the king, because there was a purpose for her to be there. And it says, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, "What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom." Wow. I mean, he was really, what do you want? Up to half of the kingdom. Now, I believe after he had said this sitting on the throne, he had made this decree from the throne, so he couldn't change his mind. I believe later on you can see some things where the king is saying, boy, I think I bit off more than I can chew. I think I've offered her more than I want to give her. But he never changed his mind, because his mind could not be changed. It was the law of the Medes and the Persians. And Esther answered, "If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king says, "Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther had said." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, his choice, not hers, "What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom, it shall be performed." He's kind of getting nervous. But what do you want? I mean, I promised you half of the kingdom. And she says, then answered Esther and said, "My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said." So, wow. So far, all she's asking is that the king would come to another banquet. Now, Haman is the one who is going to be invited to this banquet. But remember Haman's obsession. He has a hatred for little man by the name of Mordecai. Two things, I believe, are behind this hatred. Number one, he has a hatred for Mordecai's God. The Persians were anti-God. They had many gods, but truly the God of Israel was not one of their gods. And so he had a hatred for Mordecai's God. He also, this hatred came to light because he came to realize that Mordecai would not bow down to him because his God says, have no other gods before you. Don't bow down to any other God. So he also had a hatred for the Jewish law. He had a hatred. Chapter 3 and verse 8, we find when he was talking to the king, chapter 3, verse 8, and Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. So he hated the king's laws. Two things that caused the Lord to be hated and his people, hated because of God himself, and hated because of God's word. And so Haman was now invited to this banquet. The fast is over. Esther dresses up, comes before the king, and he receives her. She risks her life. She's in forbidden territory. But now she's asked for her petition, and she said, I want to invite you and Haman to a banquet. They came to that banquet. I suppose that Haman, can you just imagine Haman as he came to that first banquet that night? He was probably so excited, he was all puffed up already. I can imagine when he talked to his wife, he said, honey, you're not going to believe what happened. I'm going to a banquet tonight. And the queen is asked for me, probably put himself first, and the king second, to come to this banquet. Man, was he really excited about that. And so then when he heads back from that banquet that night, he goes home even more excited than ever because, honey, can you believe this? You're not going to believe this. She's asked for me and the king to come back for another banquet tomorrow night. Wow. He was surely excited about that. So we find in these verses, looking Esther 5, verses 4 and 8, I believe your first fill in the blank was there was two banquets. And so in chapter number 4, when she comes, Esther comes to this first banquet, and she says, if it seemed good unto the king. Notice how she treated the king. She treated the king with great respect. She came and she says, if it be please the king, let the king and Haman come this day into the banquet. And so he had already told her that I've given you a blank check. And so she came, and the banquet went well. And then she said, he said, what is your request? And she said, well, let's have another banquet, and we'll talk about the request at that time. And so she came, and Haman, verse 9, it says, then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. He went away from that first banquet, and he was so happy. He was on his way home to really tell the good news to his wife again, but something happened. He says in verse 9, then Haman went forth that day joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Wow. Haman was trying to be upbeat about this wonderful thing that was happening. He was with the king and the queen, just the three of them in a banquet, all three of them being together. So he was a little upbeat because of that, but there was a little bittersweetness to that. It was that little unbowing Jew that was causing him to take some of his joy away. It was sweet that he was going to a second banquet, but there was something that was, wow, it was just eating at his heart. So it says in these verses, in verse 10, nevertheless Haman refrained himself. And when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. And notice the second blank you can fill in is Haman's overflowing pride. You know, the Bible says much about pride in the Proverbs. Proverbs 16 and verse 18, you're very familiar with the verses on pride. Pride goeth before destruction, and haughty spirit before fall. There's many other verses concerning pride in the Proverbs and in the Bible. Proverbs 29 and verse number 23. Proverbs 29 and verse 23 says, a man's pride shall bring him low. A man's pride shall bring him low. So Haman, he goes home, and now he's still pretty upbeat, although he's got this thing gnawing in his heart about this little Jew that won't bow down to him. But he goes home and he begins to talk to his wife and his friends that are there. And notice in verse 11 what he did. It says, and Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the kings and servants, and all the princes and servants of the king. So he boasts of his earthly things, his capital, his children, his promotion to be right under the king, and his favor with the queen. And then there was going to be another banquet. So there's much to be rejoiced, and they were really kind of having a great rejoicing party at Haman's house that night. And verse 12 says, Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself. And tomorrow, can you believe this, he said? Can you believe it? Tomorrow I'm invited to go back with the king also, another banquet. But then verse 13 says, yet. Circle that thought. Yet, there's a problem. He said, yet, and all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He said, all these things I have every reason to rejoice, but yet it's hard for me to get victory because of that little Jew. The unbowing Jew, that's the next fill in the blank. He was still bugged by the one that was loyal to God. Can I tell you, you be loyal to the Lord and you're going to bug somebody. You do right, act right, talk right, look right, you're going to make somebody unhappy. Chapter 5, verse 14, we have the counsel of the ungodly. The counsel of the ungodly. Then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends unto him. So here was his wife and his friends going to give him counsel. Now the Bible says, he that findeth a wife findeth a good thing. Wives are good counsel. Men have wives to give them counsel. And wives have men to listen to their counsel, basically. The truth has been spoken. But then said Zeresh and his wife and all his friends unto him, they said, listen, we're getting tired of hearing you talk about this. I mean, you come home, and every day you come home, and you have a lot to rejoice about. You've been promoted. You know, we have this nice house that's been given to us. We have everything we would want. We're right under the king. Come on. And now all you want to do is complain about that little Jew. Let's do something about him. And here they gave this request. It's kind of humorous, really. It says, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high. 50 cubits high. 50 cubits translated into feet, and that would be a gallows about 75 to 80 feet high. Now, If you would look up, the top of this auditorium might be about 75 or 80 feet high. They're going to build a gallows 75 feet high to hang a 5-foot Jew. Brother, it's a little bit of an overreaction, don't you think? But you know the purpose of that is because Haman wanted everyone to see who's in control. Just like when they put Jesus on the cross and they put him out where everybody could see him and to make a humiliation of him. And they wanted to humiliate the Jewish people. They wanted to humiliate Mordecai. And so, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou and merrily with the king into the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Wow. Hatred for the little Jew, and a hatred for the Jewish people. The decree had been given. Adar 13th, the last month of the year, on the 13th day of the month, all men, women, boys, and girls that are of Jewish blood will be killed. Hitler's 6 million Jews led to death, many of them in the gas chambers. The Romans threw the believers, many of them Jewish believers, to the lions in the Colosseum. During the Dark Ages, what's called the Dark Ages of history, some 50 million believers were killed for their faith. Burned at the stake, put in bags and thrown into the river. Wow. As I was looking at studying also the book of Job at the same time, you know, Haman's wife gave him bad advice. Job's wife was not a very kind wife. Here he is, Job has lost everything. They've lost all their family. They've lost all their goods. She had evidently had not been touched. She was still healthy, but they'd lost all their material goods. And so she said to her husband, instead of coming to his aid when he was there of all the sores on him and in his misery, she just looked at him and said, why don't you just curse God and die? Wow. In the book of Ruth, Naomi gave her 2 daughters-in-law bad advice. She was going back to Bethlehem, Judah, but she said, you girls just stay down here in Moab. That was bad advice, Naomi. Jezebel told her husband, Ahab, when Naboth would not sell the vineyard to Ahab, and Ahab was disappointed, and she says, well, you're the boss, just take it. And so she gave him bad advice. Herodias, when her lewd daughter was dancing and incited King Herod, and the king got so excited in his lust that he said to that daughter, ask of me whatsoever, and I'll give it thee. And so Herodias said to her wicked mother, Mom, what should I ask of Herod? And she said, ask for John the Baptist's head on a platter. And so she asked for John the Baptist's head to be cut off, and it was. Wow. As wicked as Pilate was, his wife gave him good advice. Pilate's wife said, have nothing to do with this just man. Solomon said in the Proverbs, he that findeth a virtuous woman. Let me just read it. Proverbs chapter number 31. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. You know, Solomon, 700 wives, 300 concubines. That doesn't mean those were bad women. He had a bad heart. He couldn't have found one when he was looking for her because it was his heart, probably more than theirs. The Bible shows us a lot of good women in the Bible. I was looking at the scriptures this week, and in the story of Christ, there's 4 Marys. We only think of one Mary. We think of his mother, but there's 4 Marys that were very prominent in the life of Christ, good, godly women. There was Lois and Eunice, the mother and grandmother of Timothy. There was Hannah in the Old Testament, and Ruth and Lydia. And you think about this, it's brought to my attention that never gets any print, but there was Mrs. Noah. You know, Noah, for 120 years, stayed on the job preaching, and not only did his kids stay with him, but his wife stayed with him during that time. But we have here that Haman's wife gave him bad advice. Said, why don't you just hang this Mordecai. Get that thorn out of your flesh. Get that sore spot away from you. You're number 2 in the kingdom. And so he commanded that the gallows be built. Next week, or this Wednesday night, we'll look at some of the rest of the story. If you can picture now, the day goes to the conclusion and the king goes to bed, and he can't go to sleep. There are several reasons I believe he can't go to sleep. Number 1, he's worrying, I wonder what that woman's going to ask for me. I've said I'll give her up to half of the kingdom. I wonder if she'll really take it. I wonder what she'll ask. But in my own heart, I believe another thing was bothering the king that night when he couldn't sleep. He might have said to some of the men that were serving there, he says, hey, what's all that noise I hear out there? Oh, king, Haman, they're out there building some gallows. I guess somebody's going to hang somebody. They are? Ooh. The king might have been thinking, I hope it ain't me. I hope it ain't me. He couldn't sleep. He has the king's records brought in. Read the records to me. It'll put me to sleep. And they started reading the records of things that had happened recently in the kingdom. They read this story about one of his servants by the name of Mordecai uncovered a plot to kill, that 2 men were going to kill the king. And he said, hold a minute. Did we do anything? Did we do anything for Mordecai? No, sir, we didn't. Oh, I'm going to take care of that. All in God's providence. All in God's timing. It's all God bringing everything together that will be for his honor and for his glory. We'll continue it on Wednesday night. Would you stand with me, please? I want to ask you to sing a hymn, Brother Rick, if you would. I know Rick picked some invitation songs. I think I found the right one that I thought would be fitting for here. It's page 180, Brother Rick, if you wouldn't mind. If God will take care of you. If you fellows could find that up there for the screen, or if you have a hymn in front of you. And this is a great story that God will take care of us. Because some things that we don't understand that are taking place, God is preparing some things behind the scene to work all the trials and tribulations out. Rick, you lead us in this, if you would. Let's sing along with Brother Rick tonight. tonight. The invitation is open if you'd like to come.
Be not dismayed, whate'er betide, God will take care of you. Beneath His wings of love abide, God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day or all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you.
Sing another verse, Brother Rick.
Through days of toil when heart doth fail, God will take care of you. When dangers fierce your path assail, God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day or all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you.
We sing the last verse. We'll sing that last verse in just a second. Can you imagine now in the kingdom of Persia? Throughout the kingdom, there is weeping and crying, and parents holding on to their children, and children pleading to their parents, "Don't let me die. Mommy, Daddy, do something. Don't let us die. They're coming to kill us, Mom." There's a lot of grief. Little did they know that there's a God that was working behind the scenes. No man could change the law of the Medes and the Persians. But God was going to work it out where there would be another law that would overcome the law of death. It would be a decree of grace that would take care of them. It's a wonderful story. Let's sing that last verse now.
No matter what may be the test, God will take care of you. Lean, weary one upon His breast, God will take care of you.
Can we believe that tonight? Can we trust Him?
God will take care of you through every day or all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you.
Lord bless you. Thanks for being in the Lord's house tonight. Shake some hands before you leave. God bless you.